Hi, welcome back to the Immerse Academy's section on missiology. This is the third lecture, and I've asked us to approach some of the difficult questions or challenging questions of a theology of religions with this attitude of humility and posture of hospitality, so that now we have a perspective or a platform from which to engage in interreligious dialogue. And just to kind of bring us all the way back to that first comment I made in the first section, that Francis Clooney reminds us, the theologian Francis Clooney says that all religion, or all theology is interreligious. Thus, when we engage in dialogue with others, we are engaging then necessarily in interreligious dialogue. So let me say a few things about interreligious dialogue. First of all, we are very aware that of the widespread of different religions in the world. We have a group here, the Christian group, 32%, here 1.6 billion Muslims, the 23%. In this pie, the Hindus are 16%, no religious affiliation, 15%, and this blue is East Asian diffuse religion. Recall that we mentioned there are groups of people who do not identify exclusively with one tradition or another, but instead have kind of a multiple religious belonging, or in this pie graph, it's called diffuse religion, perhaps practicing more than one tradition at a time. Then the light blue here, 500 million Buddhists, or 7%, indigenous religions, 5.2%, Shinto practitioners, 1%, new religions, 0.4%, and rising, I would say, especially if you're taking a look at Asian religions in particular. 23.8 million Sikhs, or Sikhs, however you pronounce that, depending on which, if you're British or American. They have 0.38%, 14 million Jews at 0.2%, and then 4.2 million Jains at 0.6%. Jains come out of the northern Indic Peninsula, sort of in the Punjab area, sharing the Punjab area with the Sikh tradition. But anyway, another Indic religion. So we are very familiar with this, with these groupings, or what we would call the major world religions. And we are also very familiar, or we're rather familiar, that is, with the idea that these religions are distributed across the globe and kind of have regional identifications. We identify the Hindu, Sikh, and Jain traditions within India or the Indic Peninsula. We usually place Buddhists and Confucianism, although that's really not mentioned on this distribution, but within China, in Japan, the Muslim community, we generally associate with the Middle East, and then with Southeast Asia. Largest conglomerate, it would be in Indonesia. And Christians we normally associate with Western hemispheres or Northern hemispheres, and of course on the African continent. But in this distribution, it's important to notice that the multicolored spheres are growing. And I've already mentioned, in my own neighborhood, literally across the street from me, I can point out different religious groups that I recognize in my neighbors. I have Hindus, Buddhists, and actually Shinto represented in my own neighborhood. And that's just the reality of the diversity of groups moving around the globe and resettling. And America's landscape is changing. Rapidly. And as America becomes a more pluralistic society, it's not lost on you that minority groups have more often than not been met with hatred and violence and acts of exclusion. I have here on this screen a few examples just from my own community, the greater Seattle community. Up in the left, these two images, I'll just start with this one at the bottom, which says Como News 4. This is graffiti on a Hindu temple in Bothell. This is about, I don't know, 3 miles from my house, just down the road. A large Hindu temple was built there. In fact, it's undergoing more reconstruction today and kind of growing. But this "Get Out" and swastika sign was spray painted on their building. The same thing was spray painted at the local middle school in Bothell. Muslims get out, swastika sign. It's the same individual who did both, kind of belying this mistrust, distrust, hate, kind of a hate crime impetus of somebody I don't understand, obviously don't understand, because this is a Hindu temple, has nothing to do with a Muslim mosque. So the individual did not recognize that. And then also this use of a swastika sign. It's a pretty standard sign of hatred in our Western culture today. And I don't know if you are familiar with the origins of the swastika sign. It in fact comes from the Sanskrit word savastika, which means goodness, wholeness, and completeness. This kind of well-being aspect from the Sanskrit was used way back in Hindu contexts. So if you go to India today, you'll see the svastika. Of course, it's flipped because when it was appropriated by Hitler and used for the socialist regime, it was used in this format, but it's usually kind of mirror image in India today. But it's used in a Hindu context, it's used in a Buddhist context, in a Jain context. All of these usages are very, very positive, and it's like kind of putting like a peace sign out there. That's the origin of that. But anyway, so how did the Hindu temple, or how did the Hindu community respond when they caught the perpetrator of this crime? And again, this kind of speaks to me volumes of how our interreligious dialogue can move forward. But they asked the individual to come in and just do community service in the community and get to know who this Hindu community was. And after the community service was finished by the individual, that person stayed on to work with the community, really got to know the Hindu community and got to know the people, the families that were affected. So I mean, this has a very positive outcome. Not all outcomes are that positive, but it's just like a little glimmer of hope for where that interreligious dialogue can go. Can we get to know our neighbors other than just try to, force them out because they're different? Up here in the upper right, this is the example of the East Side Mosque in Bellevue, which was literally burned to the ground. So it's just like an empty shell left over by arson in 2019. And as I'm recording, this is 2021. I just took a group of seminarians to this to their prayer room, which they're under reconstruction. They're reconstructing this mosque, so they cannot meet at this space, but they're meeting like in a little industrial park office building. And we visited their prayer space, and there they are, kind of in the mode of reconstructing and looking forward to establishing a larger and more beautiful building. Looking forward to meeting there. They're hoping for in 2022, the first of the year, to be moving into that space. But this greeted with acts of arson, hatred, and destruction, and kind of turning that around, inviting SPU seminarians in to observe prayer and to have a conversation with them. And then this image down here on the bottom right hand corner is from the Sikh Gurdwara, which is again from my house, very close, about 1.5 miles down the road. on Bothell Everett Highway. This is a very warm community as well. The signs, you can't see them very well, but they're holding signs that we accept everyone, we love all people, just in response to some of the violence and acts of hatred in our community. This is a picture that they wanted to post in response. And the Gurdwara, in kind of following with the Sikh tradition, they hold free meals in which significant for their community from India, men and women worship and sit and eat together. Also, all social classes mix. There is no social distinction, and this is one of their main social platforms, right? This platform of equality. So just to give you an idea of the realities of minority groups trying to establish themselves in the vicinity of majority groups, and it's these kind of acts that bring to the forefront the importance of how do we do interreligious dialogue, how do we engage with our neighbor, how do we welcome our neighbor, how do we extend hospitality and receive hospitality from these neighbors, and that this is a very important work, and I think it's vital to today's work. The case study of interreligious dialogue that I'd like to share with you right now is of the meeting and mingling of the ideas from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma, and sorry you cannot see his name Gandhi there if it's behind my picture, I apologize for that, but Mahatma means great soul, so great soul Gandhi. You may be aware that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. based his ethic of nonviolent resistance on Jesus's teachings from the Sermon of the Mount, or Sermon on the Mount. But were you also aware that he was greatly influenced by Gandhi's teaching of ahimsa, or non-harm? Although he never met Gandhi face to face, Gandhi was assassinated when he was still quite young. Dr. King visited India and studied and talked with a number of Gandhi's supporters, and learned a lot about Gandhi's project and about the ethic of non-harm, this ethic of ahimsa. Ahimsa is a very ancient ethic that comes out of early Hindu texts, the Vedic texts, and also runs through the Buddhist and the Jain texts. So it's something widely embraced by most of the Indic religions, and it was picked up by Gandhi as a way to protest and throw off, right, the British control of India, which was finally achieved through this massive effort. And you might be surprised to know that Gandhi himself learned about his own tradition as he was a student, a law student in England. He kind of went to England to pursue law. He was kind of had a more secular mind frame or framework from which he was working with, but he met transcendentalists, American transcendentalists, and British transcendentalists in Europe, in England, who said, "Hey, you're from India. Have you read the Bhagavad Gita? It's one of the seminal Hindu texts." And Gandhi's like, "Well, yeah, I know about it, but I haven't really read it." And they're like, "Wow," because it's, we find this to be a remarkable text. So they asked, and they said, "You should be reading this text." So he goes back to his own tradition, his Hindu tradition, and picks up the Bhagavad Gita. And is just really overwhelmed by this ethical teaching that he sees in the Gita. And no worries, there are many different ways to interpret the Gita, but he sees this teaching of ahimsa, or non-harm rising to the top. And so this is what he takes in his struggle against British imperial rule in India, and achieves that goal. And it's from that example then that Dr. King takes and infuses with his own Christian understanding of Jesus' teaching on the Mount, Sermon on the Mount, and then creates this ethic of nonviolent resistance and puts that into play for the civil rights activities. These are marvelous stories, and they should actually really kind of ask us to pause and consider for a moment. What if Dr. King had dismissed Gandhi as Hindu or non-Christian, or someone he really probably wouldn't gain any true knowledge or wisdom from? Where would that have left these great ideas that have absolutely shaped the 20th century for us? We go back and back, we go back time and again to both of these individuals, and I don't mean to lionize them or heroize them, unnaturally, but the mixing and mingling of ideas is some of the bedrock of the movements that we are, moving forward in our own Christian worldview. Okay, finally, I'd like to leave you with just a few points from Catherine Corneille's book. She wrote The Impossibility of Interreligious Dialogue, but she lays out these virtues and skills for ministry in an interreligious setting, and I just think these are core and very valuable skills to take note of. She says, we must enter interreligious dialogue with a measure of humility. And I've mentioned this before, obviously, in our other talks, but humility is that that attitude which encourages the openness that I speak of towards hospitality. It's humility which allows us to meet person to person without an overarching agenda that gets into the way of that relationship. Only a relationship is going to create any meaning creating between individuals. But she also reminds us that we have to have a commitment to our own faith. It's, yes, be open, but don't throw out, don't throw out your faith foundation. There is something that you are standing on. There's the path that you've traveled and the way God's written on your heart that's unique to you. It's your faith. It's your faith account. Yes, your faith account can increase and grow and mature, but don't discount what God's already done in your life and through your faith to this point. Then she also points out that we must have this kind of interconnection. I've actually already mentioned that as well. We are interconnected. We do have an interdependent reliance on our community, and that kind of interdependence and interreliance creates empathy. It creates this feeling of connection with someone else. Here we are humans, we're making our lives, we are trying to forge meaning. We are open, keeping our minds and eyes and hands wide open to what God might be doing in our life and through others toward us. And then lastly, she describes hospitality as this acceptance of the other as the other. And I have suggested my view of hospitality is this idea of openness to God's grace in unexpected ways. But they are compatible understandings of hospitality, this kind of open hands, open heart, listening perspective, listening attitude, in which God can work how God's going to work, and we'll still be open to that. So these are virtues and skills for ministry in an interreligious setting. So the activity I'd like you to consider after listening to this last talk is work with your own region, with your own city, your own area. I'd like you to print out a local map of your home city, and then try to identify as many places of worship that you can. And I've suggested an Islamic mosque, a Buddhist temple, a Jewish synagogue, a Hindu temple, and if you can find a Sikh Gurdwara, add that as well, or other perhaps new religions that you find on your map, and mark these. And the reflection that I'm asking you to do is, how aware before you did this activity were you of the diverse centers of worship in your area? Do you think any differently about where you live in context of this religious diversity? And then finally, how much knowledge do you personally have of how different religious groups worship? Okay, so these are the questions that you might be asking yourself after this third installment.